Judging by my track record recently, who knows how long this one will be relevant for, but I'm gonna make it anyway, so y'all out there wanting to learn the melee combat style and how to do damage with it can use it right now. And by learning the combat style now, you'll be able to adapt better in the future to whatever changes happen. Without any further delay, let's go ahead and get right into this guide. So just like the other two combat styles, we're gonna be talking about the abilities first. Now, with how many abilities melee has in general, I could be spending an hour alone on these abilities, how they work together, how they're affected by different items, so on and so forth. So what I'm gonna do now is just bring up both of my melee bars, the dual wield one on top and the two-handed one just below it. And then I'll be bringing up the tooltip for the ability as I'm going over each of them. Now, some of you might be looking at these bars and saying, whoa, why is Slice even on this bar? Well, Slice is a pretty simple, pretty spammable, low-ish damage basic, and I've had this on my bars for well over a decade at this point, and back then rotations were completely different. I understand that, but it's nice to just have a single kind of backup ability, and that's what I treat Slice as. Now, an interesting thing here about Slice is if it's a stunned or bound target, it actually does more damage than most other basic attacks, but a decent number of bosses and or targets are not really stunnable, so this isn't something to really get used to, but you can definitely use it in a pinch. I would definitely call this ability the, oh crap, I've fallen into autopilot mode again and I need something right now to gain some adrenaline. Not the best, not the worst, has some niche applications. Overall, not too bad. Now, normally when I set up my melee bars, I try and mirror the same ability in each slot between dual wield and two-handed. Like if you look on the E key, I have cleave and decimate there. And this used to be the case on my W key. However, I haven't really needed Havoc anymore. Ever since Easy K got buffed, Smash is just significantly stronger with it equipped. And speaking of Smash, it is another basic. It's pretty strong. It has a relatively long cooldown for a basic, but if you equip an Easy K, it does 160 to 180% melee damage. I'll get into how the weapons work and their special attacks, their passives and whatnot later on, but Smash is definitely something worthwhile to have. Now, in its dual wield place, I have Punish there because Punish quite a while ago got a buff to where if something is below 50% adrenaline, this ability does 2.5 times more damage, making it go from something that you would never consider pressing to something that you definitely want to press inside of a berserk rotation. And for those who are unaware on terminology, rotation is just a term we use to describe the certain order of abilities that we're pressing within a given period of time. So if someone says berserk rotation, we're referring to the ultimate ability. I'll explain how it works later, but we're referring to the length of time than the ultimate and how we optimize the abilities we press in order to maximize its benefit. Decimate and cleave are both your bread and butter basics. You're going to be pressing these a decent amount. They're your go-tos. And what separates melee from the other two styles is traditionally with like magic, you have G-Conk or Sonic Wave, and you can press those every 3 global cooldowns. A global cooldown being the 1.8 second cooldown that your character incurs when you use an ability. But with melee, it's in every 4 ability block, at least for basics if you're trying to build adrenaline for something. And Decimate and Cleave do not share cooldown, meaning that you can press Decimate, then swap to a two-handed weapon and immediately press Cleave afterwards, and you will be just fine. Unlike Magic, where you can't press Sonic Wave after you press G-Conk, or vice versa. And then that gives you 2 abilities to fill in with whatever you want. Most people are going to slot in Sever, which I am jumping ahead a little bit, but this is the next ability that you're probably going to be pressing quite a bit. It's just a solid basic. you're going to be pressing this as the third ability in your little basic block. Now, most of the time when you're doing this, where you're doing like Desi, Cleave, and then 2 basics, this isn't going to be something you're doing 24/7 and like militantly following, but it is the underlying idea in terms of pressing basic abilities with melee. Dismember is not a bad ability. This is the basic bleed for melee, and it gets buffed by a weapon known as the Trim Masterwork Spear of Annihilation, but it's fallen out of favor recently. It's still worthwhile to bring the spear in a preset and use this ability because the spear makes it last 50% longer. So just doing some quick mental math, that's like a 30% damage increase on the ability. And something interesting about Dismember is it is just a flat benefit to use with a lunging swap. And this is a straight benefit because lunging is a damage increase per bleed hit, but the walk multiplier for say frag shot or combust gets reduced to 1.5 if you're moving targets. But Dismember has no walking feature to it to double its damage. So if you want to perk up a spear and bring it along, this isn't a bad ability to bring, but it's kind of fallen out of favor with me. I might replace this with something else at some point. Greater Fury is arguably one of the strongest basic abilities that melee has to offer, not so much for the damage it does, but for the effect that it has. Now, the greater abilities, as they're commonly called with melee, are Greater Fury, Greater Flurry, and Greater Barge. These are purchasable codexes that get dropped at ED2, and they're not too expensive from what I remember. I believe they've crashed quite a lot compared to what they once were. But Greater Fury, it's not bad damage. It's stronger than Desi and Cleave technically, but not by a whole lot. But its effect that it has is it guarantees a critical strike on your next ability. Now, if it's a multi-hit ability, like it's 2 hits at once, or it's a channeled ability, it's only going to work on the first hit splat. It is not for the entire like full shebang of the next ability, but it is very useful for when you just need to guarantee a crit on something. I typically save it for something like say Punish or Overpower. I'll even G Fury for like a Hurricane, even though it only guarantees 1. Overall, it is a solid press, but it has a relatively long cooldown at 15 seconds, so you definitely don't want to be spamming this 24/7. You want to be planning when you press this ability. Now, the only basic I don't have on this bar that definitely needs mentioning is the ability Chaos Roar. Chaos Roar will double the entire next ability's damage, and it works for all hit splats of the next ability if they happen on the same tick. So say you Chaos Roar a Hurricane, both of the Hurricane hits would get affected and all of the secondary hits would also get affected. If you Chaos Roar an easy K spec, it turns all of them into 30Ks if it's the bolstered one. Again, I'll explain what the special attack is later, but I digress. But Chaos Roar is an extremely strong basic that's kind of like G Fury if it drank like 16 energy drinks. However, the cooldown is 1 minute long, so you very much want to plan when you're using this rather than just pressing it willy-nilly. The last basic I'm going to mention is all the way on the other side of my dual wield bar, and that is Backhand. Both Backhand and Forceful Backhand are the abilities affected by the flanking perk, and both of these abilities inside of a Zerk definitely do solid damage. They are worth the press if you want to bother with bringing a flanking swap, and you can get access to flanking tiles on the boss that you're fighting. The last notable place I have seen flanking used was when Lucario was going for some of the really low 2-minute Nakatra kills. He was definitely using flanking there, and honestly you can use it at all of Sanctum of Rebirths. If you want to run melee Soar, just full send it, and if you don't want to bother with flanking, then you can just keep these 2 on your bar, and they are 2 stuns, so you could think of them as using like Impact or Deep Impact or Binding Shot and Tight Bindings and just use them for their stun value. Say like at Solak, if Destroy is off cooldown, you just want to save Backhand for the stun mechanic, you could do that. And the last basic to mention is Greater Barge, and again, this is arguably one of the strongest basics that melee has, because if you wait 2 global cooldowns and a tick without pressing any attacks or doing any autos. You can then barge the target, so you basically can go up to 10 tiles away and then barge back into the target and go immediately to melee distance. And then you have another window of 2 global cooldowns and 1 tick in order to press assault, destroy, greater flurry, or even frenzy. Any of those 4 abilities, if you press them, they're all channeled to begin with, but they get converted into damage over time, keeping all of the same benefits. They don't lose damage or lose ability to crit or anything like that. Very, very useful to work into your rotations. Destroy you can think of as the asphyxiate of the melee world. It does 8 hits instead of 4. This was a recent change, but for the longest time it was 4 hits. It did a stun on hit 1 and 3, and it did good damage. Recently, all of the dual wield thresholds pretty much got a rework to where all of their hits were cut in half damage wise, but then they got a doubled number of hits, and this was to help with bringing value to Leng swords and some consistency with the melee combat style. But now with Destroy, you get 8 hits, and you'll just see 2 of them pop up at the same time. It'll be like 2 hits, 2 hits, 2 hits, 2 hits every 1.2 seconds, and it still stuns on the first and third group of hits. Assault is probably the strongest threshold melee has to offer. It is a very strong ability. The cooldown is 30 seconds, so you only get 1 of these inside of your berserk, but it's definitely very strong and very worthwhile to press, even if it is in channeled form. Greater Flurry is an interesting threshold because the damage is not the strongest, but it's strong enough. But the interesting mechanic with Greater Flurry is that every single hit that it does reduces your berserk cooldown by 0.6 seconds. Thus, if you get a full Greater Flurry out, you get 4.8 seconds of cooldown reduction, and the cooldown for the ability itself is 20.4 seconds. Now, personally, I don't press this inside of berserk, but it's definitely useful at, say, something like Zamorak, where your berserk cooldown is kind of the limiting factor for you getting really fast kills. And this is something you will want to be bleeding on, say, the Witch or something like that, or you can use it in between Zerks to help with cooldown reduction. And this ability is a dual wield AoE. It will actually hit everything within a 3x3 around you. I believe the AoE hits also count for Zerk cooldown reduction, but it's a maximum of 4.8, so you can't just go into a pile of enemies, press this, and immediately get Zerk back. That would be hilarious if it actually worked, but you can't do it because it'd probably be a bit too OP. Now, on the two-hand side of things, there are 2 different abilities, and that is Hurricane and Quake. Hurricane is a single press. You can think of this ability like Wild Magic or Snapshot. It hits whatever your main target is twice for pretty solid damage and has a 20-second cooldown. However, unlike Wild Magic or Snapshot, this one is an AoE and will hit everything within you in a 3x3 or whatever the attack range of the weapon is you're holding, I should probably say, with a single hit from Hurricane. Quake also has this AoE mechanic. However, its main point is by default, this applies a 2 affinity debuff to the target that you're attacking, which, for those who don't know, affinity is just a number assigned to the formula inside of defenses for bosses. And without totally nerding out on it, essentially the higher the number of affinity stacks you have given to a target, the higher your accuracy is going to be. And a stat, Warhammer, which is very well known for giving good accuracy on its own, is a 5 affinity stack weapon. And if you press Quake with an easy K equipped, this goes up to 4. Now, it says here in the tooltip something about base hit chance. In the tooltips, there's been a lot of like language changes and whatnot, but affinity is the term that I've known for forever, and so that's just what I call it. But if you need accuracy at a boss, this is a very worthwhile ability to press. Alrighty, now we get into the fun abilities, the ultimates, and there's actually a decent number of ultimates you have with melee that are worthwhile pressing. So first off, the absolute bread and butter, the pinnacle of melee damage itself is the Berserk ability. When you press this ability, you literally go berserk and deal twice as much damage, not a 50% increase, a full-on 100% damage increase. Now, the amount of time this ability lasts is definitely shorter than something like Sunshine or Death Swiftness. By default, it's 20 seconds, near enough, and if you have the full Vestments armor set, it's about 26 seconds. And the catch with Berserk is you take an additional 50% damage when inside of this effect. So this is effectively like the ultimate glass cannon build. You spent all of your money in the round on the op, but you have no armor, no nades, no nothing else. That's this ability in a nutshell. The next ultimate is Overpower, which gets buffed by the Zuck Cape. And what the Zuck Cape does for it is makes the adrenaline cost 60% instead of 100% base, and it gives you an additional hit. And on its own, this ability will pretty much max out anywhere you're pressing it as long as you're inside of a Berserk. And I would not recommend Chaos Roaring this ability anywhere unless there is a very specific reason that a rotation is requiring it for whatever reason. I've seen Chaos Roar Overpower used at Zami on, I believe, the red or the gray bar because it guarantees double 32.5Ks, because that for some reason is the hit cap at Zam, but I digress. Overall, very solid ultimate ability. You will definitely want to be pressing this and making this ability a priority in a Zerk rotation. Now, the other ultimate has been kind of dead content for a long time, but it recently got revitalized when EZK got a buff. And what EZK does for it is makes it cost 60% adrenaline instead of 100, similar to how the Zuck Cape works for Overpower. And this ability is just kind of a single hit variant of Overpower, so you're only getting 130k instead of 2, but the nice thing about it is your target will be dealing 25% less damage to you for 30 seconds. And if you manage to kill a target with this ability, you gain 50% adrenaline. So I believe if you're doing a Masket 1k or 2ks, this ability is used somewhere in the rotation in order to gain a bunch of adrenaline, because it's gonna one-shot the little minions up on phase 6 if you're going up, that is. I also use this at places like Zami or at Art Glacier because 25% damage reduction and also doing damage in a Zerk, it definitely takes the edge off. And overall, this is definitely worthwhile having somewhere on your ability bar. And last but certainly not least is Meteor Strike. This is the crit adren buffing ultimate. It also does the same damage as an Overpower, so it essentially is going to be a 30k or close enough, at least over 20k damage per press. Now, the nice thing about Meteor Strike is it is a large AoE and it does anything within your attack range. It says within 1 tile of you, but if you equip something like a Tumikin's Light or a Scythe, it'll hit everything within a 5x5 instead of a 3x3 around you. And it gives you the effect where critical strikes generate an additional 8% adrenaline for 30 seconds, and that is per hit. Very, very useful for melee in general, because you're definitely going to be wanting to have a lot of adrenaline for some of the EoFs I'll go over later on, and all of the thresholds and ultimates you're going to be wanting to press inside of a Zerk rotation. Adrenaline and having lots of it in abundance is going to be your best friend. Now, the only other ability I haven't mentioned that I do use at times is Bladed Dive and Dive respectively. I do mostly use it as a movement ability, but Bladed Dive itself has some use cases, like if you're on a newer account and you want to clear the pools pretty easily at Raksha, you can use Laceration Boots and like a Lania Kia Spear to just Bladed Dive the pools there, and it will hit within whatever the attack range of the weapon is. And if a target dies, or if your main target dies, I should say, from using a Bladed bladed dive, it instantaneously resets the cooldown. So if you have a bunch of very low health targets, because it doesn't do a whole lot of damage, it's essentially weaker than Slice without the stun effect. You can definitely use it to your advantage, but it's a niche ability and it's only usable with dual wields by default. I don't think anyone's bringing lacerations anywhere, maybe in some weird AoE scenarios, but I did want to bring that up. Every other melee ability right now is either hyper niche to a very specific rotation or flat out just not used. The honorable mention I will give is Slaughter, because it's a threshold bleed that hits pretty strong, and if you are on a movable target, it is a triple damage increase instead of a double. And I have seen people use Chaos Roared Slaughters in certain places before to large effect, because essentially you're getting like a 6,700 bleed that hits like 8 or 9 times. But ever since Easy K got adjusted, I really don't use bleeds anymore. I don't use blood tendrils. I don't use slaughter. I barely press dismember unless I absolutely need to. Maybe if we get an update for a dead content ability to turn into the old Easy K spec, this will make a return, but for now I don't see that happening. Frenzy, I also don't have on my bars. I'll mention it here because it was part of the dual wield update. It is a dual wield ultimate that can be bled by Greater Barge, but right now it's doing significantly less damage if you barge bleed it for whatever reason instead of just casting it normally. So I haven't included it in this DPS guide because who knows when that update is coming out, but I did feel I should at least mention it here. And any other ability that I haven't mentioned, just don't use it and you'll be just fine. Alrighty, now that I've gone over the abilities that I use, let's go ahead and talk about special attacks, the main weapons and their passives, and the EoFs that you'll be using with melee. Now in this section, I'm fully omitting anything with AoE farming or AoE damage with melee. That is an entirely different topic. I'm focusing here on single target DPS, but if you want to look up some stuff about melee AoE, it's pretty straightforward. The EoFs you would want to look into are Dragon Halberd and Dragon Two-Hander, and then the main AoE weapon is Tumikin's Light, but I don't want this guide being like an hour long, so I'm just going to omit that for this DPS guide. Now, the bread and butter best weapon for melee by far and special attack coming with it is the Easy K. This weapon has 2 passives on it, one tied to the sword itself and the other passive tied to the effect that it places on whatever target you are attacking. The passive effect tied to the weapon itself is the Ashen Vow. It bolsters Pulverize, Smash, and Quake abilities. I talked about it in the ability section if you want the details on that, but it makes those abilities very compelling to press if you need them. And before I explain the second passive, I should explain the special attack that the sword does, which is Igneous Showdown. Essentially, it is a very large hit. It's not quite as strong as, say, an Overpower or a Pulverize hit, but it's close enough, and it costs 50% adrenaline. Now, that actually sounds pretty weak. Everyone's used to hearing the Bonk Sword and Easy K being the most busted thing ever, but this is only on the first press of the Easy K spec. When you use the special attack on a target, it then applies the Flamebound Rival passive effect to the target. So if you Easy K spec on the same target again, that's where you get the ridiculous 120k damage in a single tick. Usually you need Chaos Roar for that to be the case, but even without it, it's still insanely strong. But the second Easy K spec on the same target is 4 hits instead of 1. They all hit ridiculously strong, and it generates 15% adrenaline, so the cost is only 35% instead of 50%. Now the passive that Flamebound Rival does, other than what it affects with the special attack, is you do an additional 12% damage to that target and you take 12% less damage from the target that has it. So if you mark a boss with easy K spec and it has Flamebound Rival and you use something like Pulverize, that negates most of the damage increase with Berserk and makes it a lot more comfortable to use. And this is just a flat 12% damage buff. This isn't like a weird additive number. It's just 12% extra damage, all said and done. Now, the other bread and butter melee weapons that you're going to want to have access to are the Leng Swords. The Leng Swords, technically speaking, have a different passive effect for each sword, but they're essentially the same. They kind of split it up a little bit so that way you aren't using just other offhands to get the full benefit. But the main hand's passive is called Endless Frost, and every single hit splat you do, you have a 10% chance to generate a Primordial Ice stack, and the offhand has a 2% chance to generate Primordial Ice stacks as well. And the offhand has the additional part where if you apply a Primordial Ice stack, you get the Frostblades effect for 9 seconds. And how Frostblades works, if you look at it, it says it deals an additional 543 bonus damage for each hit you do. But if you look there in parentheses, it says 24%. And this is a somewhat misleading figure in the tooltip where people will look at that and just assume, oh, it's a 24% damage increase when this passive is active, that makes it better than Easy K. Well, it's not that simple, because how bonus damage works is it just takes the value that it states and adds it onto whatever hit splat you happen to do. So say you hit an ability like a Slice and it only does 1,000 damage for whatever reason, this is just for example's sake, it would then be 1,543 damage for the hit instead of the original 1,000 if you're under the Frostblades effect, which sounds really nice. That's almost what, 30% damage increase, if not a little bit more compared to the original. It sounds pretty strong. But if you do an ability that is a 20,000 damage hit, it is only 20,543. Quite a massive law of diminishing return, where the more damage you're doing per hit splat, the less effective Frostblades becomes. Unlike the Easy K passive, where it's just a flat 12% all the time. Now, the diminishing return point where Frostblades becomes less effective than the Easy K passive is right around the 72 to 7,300 damage mark. Right in that zone is where the 12% from Easy K is going to start applying more damage to each hit. Now, is this worthwhile focusing over and trying to min-max? Absolutely not. Because Frostblades is a random proc per hit, it's effectively a 12% chance per hit splat you do, so there isn't much consistency you can get. Sometimes you'll just get Leng stack after Leng stack, other times you'll get none. It's just kind of a luck of the draw, a roll of the dice situation. Whereas Easy K is just a clean, consistent, always applied 12%, so that's the one that you definitely want to be focusing on using. Plus it has the bolstered abilities. Now, the special attack for Leng Swords is actually pretty strong. It's only a 15-second cooldown, and how it works is you can have up to 10 Primordial Ice stacks, and the swords themselves do a relatively decent chunk for a base hit. It's about the same damage as like a Decimate and a Smash being hit together at the same time, but for each stack that you have, when you press it, it costs less adrenaline and gives you additional damage. So if you have like 8 or 10 Primordial Ice stacks, that's probably going to hit cap inside of a Zerk. And once you hit 3 stacks, the ability becomes free cost, so there's no adrenaline cost with it. It's pretty much always worthwhile to press inside of a Zerk if you have the stacks, that is. Overall, these are some swords that you will definitely want to own. Now, the next physical special attack I'm going to be talking about, because I think it's a waste of an EoF slot, is the Dragon Battle Axe. The DBA is very simple. It gives you a damage increase. It is a multiplicative damage increase, not an additive. It's effectively a 20% damage increase for about a minute in duration, but you are less accurate when you activate it because it's draining your non-strength skills, but boosting your strength skill in general with the 20% add-on. So if they actually go through with the 120 combats, now that I'm thinking about this, DBA might need to be slightly actually wait, no. Whoever's listening at this point in the video, no one mention this anywhere else, okay? Keep this completely quiet. We don't need to tell Jagex that DBA is going to need a rework once they do 120 combats, because the way it's written, it's fully fine, guys. Don't worry about it. I trust you to keep this secret with me. Overall, DBA is something that you'll be using at the Adrenaline Crystal. Overall, DBA is something you'll see people using at the Adrenaline Crystal because you can carry the buff in. It's a minute long and Zerk is only like 20 seconds. And so people think, all right, if it covers the first Zerk, it's free damage. Now there are three main EoFs that I want to talk about with Melee. The first one is actually the Dragon Scimitar. And what this spec does is it costs 25% adren, but it gives you 25% accuracy on any slashing weapon for a minute. And both EZK and Lang swords count as slashing weapons, so as long as you're using those, it's just free 25% accuracy increase. And the hit itself is actually pretty strong. When I use this at Karapak, if for a single hit, it's hitting like 20 to 24k damage. So you don't have to really think about this one as sacrificing too much damage for the accuracy. It's pretty strong on its own. Now, I won't lie, this next EoF is actually kind of a meme. I don't really expect anyone, maybe people will do this because of how cheap it is now, and there's a technicality on why it's in here, but that would be the ZGS EoF.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Now, can you use a physical ZGS to cast the special attack and be off to the races and it will do pretty much the same exact thing? Absolutely. However, if you look here, it says 35 to 45% melee damage per hit every 1.8 seconds to the target whilst inside the area of the special attack, because ZGS is a 20-second version of like a really weak sunshine, because it makes a 7x7 area that you can stand in and get the 25% damage buff. Yeah, it's something. EZK isn't really an in-between Zerk thing anymore, so after you do your Zerk rotation, melee kind of just falls flat on its face at that point, and ZGS is the only real filler at this point, but it still doesn't feel the greatest to use because the damage increase isn't that good. But the reason it's inside of an EoF is ZGS is a tier 92 weapon, and so that 35 to 45% melee damage, that is based off of the weapon that you are equipping at the time. So if you have an EZK or Langs, especially if they have shards on them, the little attacks from the ZGS will do more damage based off of the weapons that you're holding. And again, this is a major technicality thing. If you guys don't put a ZGS inside of an EoF, actually, I'm just gonna tell you, don't bother unless for some reason the little hits not doing the full potential of their damage bothers you for some reason. I would say just bring a physical ZGS. There is another argument you could make of if you don't want to put perks on the ZGS, but I'll leave that up to y'all to decide. The last EoF I want to talk about, this is the absolute tried and true now mainstay EoF that you're going to be using quite a lot, and that is the Mercy Dagger. Now, I went over this EoF spec in detail on the video where I talked about all the new heist weapons and how they work inside of EoFs with the respective combat style, but essentially this is just a hyper consistent Dragon Claw that is very much needed for the style, because before, if you used a Dragon Claw EoF and you were kind of being risky with it on your adrenaline and nothing crit, you were just out of luck, but this spec effectively has crit chance built into its spec to where the last hit is pretty much always guaranteed to crit. I think there's like because of how it works with the numbers, there's like a technicality of like it cannot crit on the last hit, but that's exceedingly rare. Overall, if you can afford the dagger, it was 500 mil when I bought it, and then it went back up to like 1 bill, and then who knows where it is at this point. I'm sure it's getting merched to death and back. If you can afford the Mercy Dagger, absolutely pick one of these up. And if you don't want to pay for it, you could try getting one from heists. But again, you definitely want this EoF at some point. All right, so we're going to get away from like the background footage with all the tooltips and whatnot. And I want to bring your attention to my inventory real quick, because there's a couple of niche items in here that I do think need some explaining. Karis only works in a couple of places, and the only relevant places you're going to be using this new consecrated Karis is at Sanctum of Rebirth or Amasket herself. And yes, the consecrated Karis is only a tier 80 weapon, but the 33% damage increase with the chance of doing plus 200% damage on occasion is still significantly stronger than a tier 100 Zuck sword and its 12% damage. And right next to it, I just have a Desert Amulet 4. It can be a Desert Amulet 3. The only difference between the two is the actual damage bonuses on them. So if you're going to be doing a lot of Soar or a Masket, this is definitely something you'll want to get. And I think if you're doing a Masket, you have to get it because it's part of the quest line. But I did want to bring it to y'all's attention. This new amulet that came out, the Am Hedge, it's technically a better DPS solution than even an EoF, but it's only if you're not going to be using the amulet next to it, which is the Amulet of Zealots. It has almost the same damage bonus as an EoF, but it does 4% additional damage, which is 5% of your strength level. And so if you don't mind switching back and forth between an EoF and this amulet, so say you only had like the Mercy Dagger, you didn't need you don't have a ZGS EoF and you don't need DSIM, this one's not too bad to where all you do is switch to the EoF for spec and then put this back on for everything else. But the only time you wouldn't want to use this amulet is if you're going to be using Zealots. And the only time you're going to be using this is if you're on the prayer book instead of the curses book and you are at a place where you have the accuracy in order to use it. The two places off the top of my head where I would use the prayer book and Zealots would be Karapak and Art Glacor. And Art Glacor, it's only at low enrage, around 1000%. I'm pretty much swapping over to curses, and I will go ahead and bring this Am Hedge or Am whatever it is, the new Zuck amulet or the new Obsidian amulet, whatever the heck this thing is classified as. If you're going to be taking a lot of damage though, and you want to be focused more on survivability, you can just camp the EoF to your heart's content, and then you have the Ami of Souls benefit where Soul Split's healing more and you have 10% on your overheads. However, if you're using any of these amulets, a simple item that you can buy, they're not too expensive, but the Powder of Protection gives you an extra 10% damage reduction on your protects and your deflects, and this does not stack with EoF to give you 70%. It'll just bring you up to 60%, but it's nice because the damage intake will be the same when you're using these non-EoF amulet. Now, the absolute last thing I need to cover here before we go into rotations is this ECB sitting in my inventory, and this is like the age-old meme. This started a long time ago, and it's still a kind of long-standing joke in the RuneScape PVM community of that Gricko is the best melee basic. And the reason this is a thing is Gricko, if you're under some sort of crit buff, is just a massive surge of adrenaline, especially in combination with Hydrix bolts. Now, you don't need an ECB in order to have this effect. You could use a Wyvern crossbow, a Royal crossbow. I've seen people use main hand blights because those most things are like 80 mil at this point. I just have this ECB left over from when range still used a physical ECB, but the main thing you want is some form of aftershock and some form of corroming. Mainly you want corroming 4, that is the requirement for a perk. It doesn't really matter if it comes with anything. And then just some form of aftershock to keep your aftershock stacks. In fact, if you just have a blank aftershock 4, that would work just fine with a corroming 4 because you don't care about Greco damage when using melee. You just want its adrenaline property. Alrighty, it is that time where we finally press some buttons and do some damage and look at a couple of example rotations. Now, I'll be 100% honest, these are not going to be the most optimized, insanely perfect, best damage rotations. These are what I would do if I was melee camping. And to be fair, I haven't done real, genuine melee camp since they changed the EZK. And so what I'm going to do is just sort of a extended rotation where I showcase what I would do and how I would manage getting the EZK buff as soon as possible on target, and go through the first Zerk, the in-between the first and second Zerk, and second Zerk. Now, what I have found most helpful to do in order to deal with the first spec being pretty weak with EZK is before I go into a boss instance, I will just stall a meteor strike and then release said meteor strike with an EZK spec. I did a whole video on ability stalling a little while ago. I'll put a card up in the upper right. So if you want to see the full breakdown on how it actually works, there is that video for you. But the short version is when you want to stall an ability, just stand here at wars, you click this dummy, stall an ability, grab your adrenaline because this doesn't wipe your stall, and as long as you stay in combat, you keep it. And then when you find the target you want, I use necromancy incantations like Lord of Bones in order to keep my stall. But then once you find the target, like the boss you're going into, you would then target cycle, use something like Smoke Cloud to release the stall, and then just press EZK. So it would look something like this: target cycle, Smoke Cloud, that's the meteor strike, and then you can press EZK afterwards. There is a large gap in between because I'm just explaining how this works. But in practice, you can do these both in the same game tick and be off to the races on the target, build back up for Zerk. Something like Greco is going to be very advantageous because now you're under a crit buff. But I did want to explain that before we go into an example rotation. Now, that is a pretty simple, straightforward, quote unquote, pre-build. Although there really isn't a pre-build element, you're just bringing in an extra ability to help you deal with the first kind of weak EZK spec. If you want to go off the deep end with pre-builds, I could do an entire video dedicated to all the pre-builds that I know about. So leave it in the comments below if that'd be something you're interested in, but I'm not going to be doing that on this particular DPS guide. But that example rotation would look something like this. So we'll go ahead and stall our meteor, grab our adrenaline, and we'll go ahead and dive back up, and then go over to the target, release the meteor and EZK, and then Greco, equip the dual wield in the same tick, hit anticipate, berserk, and then barge with APOT. And I'm just going to bleed destroy here, hit like an overpower and maybe go for an assault, maybe hit a dagger spec. It's like a G Fury with smash. Be another dagger spec, cleave, Desi, another dagger spec, and I'll probably hit Hurricane here. And then I'm just gonna go for another incendiary shot and maybe hit a couple of basics here. Greco for the adrenaline. Go for an EZK spec. Or not an EZK spec, sorry, a ZGS spec. Just build up here with basics. Go for another overpower. Cleave, Desi. I'll just go for another Hurricane. If you want to save it for the upcoming Zerk, go ahead. Maybe hit like a 2-hit G Flurry. And then here I'm going to Meteor Strike again. And then Greco. Maybe hit a couple of defensives here because I didn't quite the adrenaline I want. But then Zerk. And then Barge. Be a basic and bleed the Assault. And here I should get another Greco. And here I'm going to Chaos Roar into an EZK. It hits like a dump truck. Overpower. Hit a couple dagger specs. And then a Hurricane maybe. Just kind of improv from here. and honestly just go on from there. Now again, that is not like the world's best melee camp rotation, it's just more of an example of showing kind of how I just improv through things. I look for what abilities are available. Now if you want in ZGS, you could simply skip the hurricane. I like to press it just because it's strong, and what I can't do on this combat dummy is accurately show how good punish is, because the combat dummy always stays at 100k, it's never at 50k or below, it heals every single game tick. What I'm gonna do real quick is go ahead and grab the prayers and show how that looks like. All right, so now I have the prayers here, and I'm going to activate Divine Rage and Piety. So this is not like the full Zealot setup for damage. I'm just doing this so we can use Eclipse Soul and get an extra 4% crit chance, just to see how different that feels. So just like before, we'll go ahead and grab a Meteor Strike, install it, grab our Adrenaline, and we'll go ahead and dive over. I'm going to start on this middle dummy, so I'm just go ahead and target Cycle Release with the EK. Go for a Gricko, Anticipate, Zerk, and then go ahead and Barge, Bleed to Destroy, maybe Overpower. And here I'm just going to Chaos Roar into a Dagger Spec, maybe Smash and hit Assault. Go for another Gricko real quick. Maybe another Dagger Spec, and then Smash into a Hurricane. Then here, I'm just going to go ahead and hit Incendiary, Piercing Shot, another Gricko. Go for my ZGS spec here, and this time I'm going to try not to hit Hurricane, so that way I have Bleed Destroy. Hit a few more basics, maybe go for another Gricko and do a couple hits on my G Flurry. We get hit some more basics and then end with a Meteor Strike, Gricko, Anticipate into a Zerk. Then I'm going to go ahead and Barge again, hit a Destroy into a G Flurry, or G Fury, excuse me. Get a couple of Dagger EoFs, hit an Overpower, go for an Assault. And here I'm going to Chaos Roar again and hit my Easy K spec. Got to relent there. I hit Greater Ricochet anyways, and then finish it off with a Hurricane, with a Dagger spec before. I got caught off there by that Relent proc. I wasn't expecting it. If you get a Relent proc, you probably don't need to hit Greater Ricochet in order to get more Adrenaline, because Easy K is going to crit usually a couple of times. But as you notice, the Adrenaline was a bit more friendly, and that's just because we have a flat 4% crit chance from our overhead. Now, these prayers heal a lot less, but you get the extra crit chance. So if you're at a place where survivability isn't too difficult, then you could try using this. But I did want to showcase those differences. Now, something I do want to point out here is the reason I press the dual wield equip directly after Gricko is when you equip the melee weapons, that's when you get the Vestments passive in order to have the additional 20% Adrenaline. Because if I just sit here and attack with range, then all of a sudden, you know, it's like I'm just stuck at 100%. If I was with melee, it goes to 108, and then it goes back down if I equip a range weapon. But if I Gricko, I didn't get any Hydrix procs there, and I'm not on crit buff, but the crit adren allows you to go past 100. So anytime you Gricko with melee, it doesn't have to be the dual wield. You can do it with the two-handed weapon, so it's one less input for y'all, but that is something to keep in mind. And well, I think I have info dumped on y'all enough. Hopefully you found something helpful in this guide, but that's all I really have to say on that.